Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Milan Svolik, an associate professor of political science. His research and teaching focus on comparative politics, political economy, and formal political theory. Professor Svolik has authored articles on the politics of authoritarian regimes and democratization in leading political science journals, as well as a book entitled The Politics of Authoritarian Rule, and the forthcoming book entitled Democratization in the Age of Elections. Today we'll talk with Professor Svolik about polarization, partisan conflict, and the subversion of democracy in Latin America. Welcome, Professor Svolik.
Thank you.
Let's start with the paper you're currently working on. Give us an overview of it.
So the paper that I'm working on currently is called When Polarization Trumps Civic Virtue, and it is about the breakdown of democracy worldwide, but the specific case is Venezuela.
Okay.
The purpose of the paper is to help us understand why and how democracies go from democracy back to dictatorship. And if we look at the pattern of these breakdowns, there's something interesting that has happened since the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, and even before, the primary way in which democracies broke down was by military coups. Mm-hmm. So this is when an extra institutional force, the military, overthrows a democratically elected government, and there are some prominent examples of these. So Pinochet's overthrow in Chile in the early 1970s, or more recently, the overthrow of Mohamed Morsi, the democratically elected president of Egypt, by the military about 2 years ago. But ever since the end of the Cold War, there's a different trend. So rather than military coups, the predominant form of what we call democratic breakdown, mm-hmm. or an authoritarian reversal, seems to be one where it's not the military, but rather elected incumbents who are subverting democracy by manipulating elections in various ways. Mm-hmm. So the trend is such that by now, it is when a democracy breaks down, it is 2 to 3 times more likely that it is the incumbent who was at first democratically elected, mm-hmm. that subverts democracy rather than the military intervenes. Okay. So some of the examples of this is Vladimir Putin in Russia, mm-hmm. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or some say Recep Erdogan in Turkey.
Okay. So what gave you the idea to look at this?
So one reason for this is that we just don't understand these forms of democratic breakdown. Mm-hmm. They were there before, but they're increasing in frequency, and they present a number of puzzles for us. And the first is that the person in these authoritarian breakdowns or executive takeovers, when they are initiated by an incumbent, they happen rarely with the threat of force. So mm-hmm. unlike in the case of military coups, this is somebody who was democratically elected, but who gradually starts subverting democracy, and over time succeeds in subverting it enough so that we no longer call the country democratic, as in the case of Russia or Venezuela or maybe Turkey today. And this is a puzzle. It seems that these incumbents are able to take advantage of something in the democratic process, mm-hmm. without using force, and nonetheless subvert democracy. Okay.
Let's look at a specific example. Do you want to speak about Venezuela, for instance?
So in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez gets elected. Mm-hmm. He's a very interesting personality because before he runs for president, he actually attempts to stage a military coup mm-hmm. in the 90s. He's unsuccessful, but before he gives up and turns in, he actually goes on the national TV and he says, "This is only for now." He then gets tried, imprisoned, and later pardoned. And later, in 1999, he actually runs in the presidential election in Venezuela and wins.
Right, which is mind-boggling, really.
Right, and it seems that this is a moment in Venezuelan history when the population is ready for someone new, someone different than mm-hmm. the two-party system that up to that point existed in mm-hmm. Venezuela. Chavez gets elected on a platform that is pro-democratic, anti-corruption, and leftist populist. But gradually, after that, he starts doing things that are undemocratic in nature. So he starts gradually intimidating the opposition, intimidating journalists. He starts running referenda that would extend his term, or more precisely, that would abolish term limits in Venezuela, and ultimately he succeeds, to a point where 8-10 years later, most political scientists agree that Venezuela is no longer a democratic country. In fact, one fact about Venezuela that is interesting in this context is that in political science there's a very strong correlation. We have very few strong correlations, but one strong one is that wealthy countries, once they become democratic, they do not go back to dictatorship. And Venezuela, by this standard, would be the richest country that ever was a democracy, but then went back to a dictatorship.
Okay, very, well, while you're speaking, of course, I'm thinking of other correlations to, for instance, the United States, with the recent news about, elections and having ties from other countries involved. So I'm curious to know what makes democracies vulnerable to subversion by elected incumbents?
So one of the arguments that I develop in this paper is that it is polarization, society-wide political polarization.
And let's define that term.
So polarization here means that on a particularly salient political dimension, so let's say a left-right division in society, which is the case in Venezuela, there are more individuals at the extremes of this distribution compared to the middle of this distribution. In other words, these are societies that lack ideological moderates and have a lot of ideological extremists. As I mentioned, this is a left versus the right division in Venezuela. In Turkey, for instance, it's those who are more secular versus those who are more Islamist. And presumably in the United States, which many claim is becoming increasingly polarized, that would also be primarily a left-right ideological division.
Okay, so how does the subversion come about?
So how does polarization connect to a potential subversion of democracy? So the idea is as follows. What distinguishes polarized societies from those that are not is that partisans on one side really hate on the other side. And incumbents can take advantage of this. They understand that precisely because of these divisions, they are able to manipulate elections. And there are many ways in which they can do this. And they will be nonetheless forgiven. And the key is, why is it that they will be forgiven in polarized societies? And the answer is that precisely because in polarized societies, supporters of one candidate cannot possibly imagine themselves voting for another candidate. Incumbents know that if they manipulate the democratic process, and even if voters for their own value democracy, for its own sake, they will nonetheless be reluctant to abandon the candidate they really like for a candidate they hate. And so this creates an opportunity for incumbents to pose a dilemma to their supporters, to say, look, I know that you may not like the fact that I'm manipulating the democratic process, but I at the same time know that most of you are going to stick with me in spite of that, precisely because this is a polarized society, and you, like me, and you would hate to defect from me and vote for the other candidate.
So I'm curious to know how you're doing your research, what your methodology is. It seems kind of a tricky business to get at people's thoughts in this area.
So I use broadly two methodologies. When I develop theory, I work with formal models of politics. So this means I try to develop simple mathematical models of political interactions. And then I use predictions derived from those models and test them in the real world. And so in this case, I did a survey in Venezuela where I tried to get at the idea that I just summarized. That is that if we have a polarized society, then as we get away from the middle of the ideological distribution of voters, that is, the more partisan voters are, more extreme their preferences are, the more willing they will be to tolerate undemocratic behavior by candidates. And so one way to do this was to do what's called a survey experiment. So in a survey, I embedded a little experiment where voters, or the respondents in this survey, were choosing between two candidates. And on purpose, there were both ideological differences between these candidates, but also sometimes a difference in the democratic platform of each candidate. So for instance, the one form that it took in this experiment was that one candidate favored an electoral commission in Venezuela that is politically impartial. So this would be the more democratic candidate. And another candidate would be the one who would be saying, I am perfectly fine with the Electoral Commission as is right now in Venezuela, which actually means it's a very politically biased Electoral Commission that favors the incumbent. But crucially, this democratic platform, or undemocratic platform, depending on which one we're talking about, was randomized. So sometimes it was the candidate on the left, and sometimes it was the candidate on the right who was democratic or undemocratic. And so what I'm able to do is then compare how voters with different intensities of partisanship respond and say, well, I'm voting for this one or that one, and to what extent voters are willing to vote for a democratic or undemocratic candidate or for their partisan candidate. And the crucial trade-off I'm trying to get at is, when is it that voters are willing to say, well, I know this candidate may not be perfectly democratic, but here's where I stand ideologically, and so I'm going to forgive that and nonetheless vote for him.
What about the other case where the candidate has gone so far away from what the voter is wanting that the voter finally says, enough?
So it doesn't really happen in this experiment, in part because these candidates are artificially created by me. So what I did is I looked at what seemed to be the main policy divisions in Venezuela. And as I mentioned, this is primarily left versus right. So the candidates on the left are socialist candidates. They're from the incumbent's party. And the candidates on the right, just as in the United States, they favor less intervention by the government in the economy, less redistribution, and so on. And so I on purpose picked these candidates so that they are very different from each other on the left-right dimension, but nonetheless realistic candidates. That is, they appeal to these two broad coalitions within the society. So in this case, we see that all voters vote roughly consistently with their ideological preferences. That is, voters on the left vote for the candidates on the left, and voters on the right vote for the candidate on the right. But something important happens as we move away from the center of the distribution of voters, so from very moderate voters to more extremist voters. And what happens is that the moderate voters are willing to say, well, maybe I'm a little bit on the left of the middle, and therefore I would favor a candidate that's somewhat left of the middle. But when that same candidate is actually the one who's proposing also at the same time an undemocratic platform, then this voter says, actually, I don't like that, so I'm going to vote for the candidate on the right. In other words, they're willing to put democracy first and their partisanship only second. But as we move away from the middle, so now we're talking about extremists, these extremists, they put their partisanship first and democracy only second. So in other words, if I'm on the left in Venezuela and the extreme left, it doesn't really matter whether my candidate is proposing a democratic or undemocratic platform. They're simply voting for the candidate on the left. And this is something that, given the intuition that I summarized before, that incumbents can take advantage of in polarized societies. A polarized society is simply one where there's a lot of people at the extremes and very few in the middle. And so incumbents can count on the fact that even if they behave undemocratically, their supporters will not abandon them out of their distaste for their undemocratic behavior.
So let's talk about the middle class, and how does that fit into your model then?
So there are...
Or does it not?
The middle class, right? So the middle class is a very tricky category in political science because there's a lot of things that could mean. And there are famous statements in political science like no bourgeoisie, no democracy that effectively claim that the middle class in some form is essential for the survival of democracy. Except it's, as I said, somewhat tricky because it could mean many things. It could mean middle income voters, or it could mean a particular class, so urban voters, for instance, as opposed to rural voters or the aristocracy. And in this context, what is clear that the kind of middle class that is really important here is ideological moderates. So voters who don't feel so strongly about either side, either party, or either candidate, that they would put that above whether those candidates are competing democratically.
And so how does that play out in Venezuela?
So in Venezuela, in the specific experiment, the way it plays out is really that the more extreme you are as a voter, the more willing you in this artificial experiment, just on paper, you are willing to say, yes, I'm still voting for my partisan candidate, even though I understand that that person is less democratic than the opposition's candidate. The purpose of this experiment is to simulate a real-world scenario where in a real election in Venezuela, just like in this experiment, usually there are candidates from two blocs, the incumbents bloc who are on the left and the opposition who are on the right. And so the idea is that this experiment should show effectively that this is the same trade-off that Venezuelan voters are making in real life. So those who are on the left, if they are very far on the left, are ultimately saying, yes, I prefer democracy to less democracy, so I prefer more democracy to less democracy. But given the difference between these two candidates and my strong preference for the leftist candidate, well, I'm going to sacrifice democracy and I guess go for the candidate that's closer to me ideologically, or in the case of Venezuela, it's simply for the one who redistributes more.
Okay. I'm thinking as you're using the word democracy, it could potentially mean different things to different people. So you're developing a model starting in Venezuela, but ultimately the model should work in virtually any country. Is that correct? So cultures are so different all over the world, obviously. So how do you factor in what the word democracy means to someone?
So even political scientists disagree about the exact criteria for what counts as a democratic country or not. And in fact, the kind of undemocratic behavior that I'm talking about is in itself a challenge for our measurement of democracy. So when an incumbent subverts democracy, rather than, let's say, a military that stages a coup, just like they did in Turkey this summer, it's not a sharp, sudden event. It usually happens over several electoral cycles. So the media, the opposition, outside observers have a chance to point out that undemocratic behavior, undemocratic trends are happening within a country, but it's often very gradual. So it means that a journalist may get arrested here and there, or a judge that rules in an inconvenient fashion will get harassed by the incumbent. And in some of the more extreme cases, candidates will simply be banned from running, or journalists, and large numbers of them, get really arrested. But precisely because this is gradual, it is often unclear to us at which point a country becomes so illiberal or undemocratic that as political scientists, we are warranted in calling these countries undemocratic. So for instance, for a long time in Venezuela, people have disagreed whether Hugo Chavez and what Hugo Chavez was doing in Venezuela was just a new kind of democracy, maybe populist, maybe a populist democracy, and at which point it really became an undemocratic country. And this is compounded by the fact that ever since the end of the Cold War, we have very few politicians, incumbents, who, when they are making these changes and taking these undemocratic steps, who would explicitly say, and that is what I'm doing. I'm on purpose making this country less democratic. Much more often what they are doing is they would say they are working on an improvement on democracy. So Vladimir Putin in Russia, for instance, talks about Russia's sovereign democracy that is free from the meddling by foreigners and Westerners. And in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was calling his democracy Bolivarian democracy. So this was a concept that he himself developed, and the idea was that in Venezuela, under his government, democracy should combine both democratic elements, so the rule of the majority, but also redistributive elements. So the idea that democracy should be socially just, and what that meant is redistributing wealth from the rich in Venezuela to the poor. Now, even in Venezuela, therefore, one objection to the study that I'm making could be that, well, maybe when you are in this little survey experiment saying that one candidate is less democratic than the other, and I never say that explicitly, but I am saying, for instance, this candidate proposes that the Electoral Commission be impartial, so presumably something that's democratic, and then another candidate will say, well, and I'm proposing that we just leave the Electoral Commission as is. So it could be that maybe those voters who are voting for the second type of candidate simply have a different understanding of democracy. And so what I did as a part of this experiment is actually ask voters first, so ask the respondents in this survey first, Well, Hugo Chavez has championed this idea of Bolivarian democracy. What do you associate it with? And so they were given several choices, among them the elimination of the inequalities between the rich and poor, but also more standard understandings of democracy, such as freedom of electoral competition, civil liberties, checks and balances, and so on. And so these voters correctly, I think about 70% of them said, yes, when we're talking about Bolivarian democracy, it's definitely about reducing inequalities between the rich and the poor. But the next question was, and so which aspect of democracy is most important for you? And there, most voters say either the competitiveness of elections, or civil liberties, or checks and balances, or political accountability. Only, I think, about 9% say that it is the reduction of the inequities between the rich and the poor. So it seems like, in spite of all kinds of possible confusions, even ordinary Venezuelans know that democracy primarily means electoral competition, and that that competition should be free and fair.
Okay, so as you're developing this model, ultimately, what do you hope to achieve?
So I hope to propose one way in which we can explain why it is that somebody like Putin in Russia, or Chavez in Venezuela, or Erdogan in Turkey are at first able to get democratically elected, and then gradually and in plain sight. So as I mentioned, this is not something that happens secretly. People write about this in newspapers, journalists write about it, the opposition complains about it both at home and abroad, and then foreign observers comment on this. And nonetheless, these incumbents stay in power, they gradually subvert democracy, and not only that, they do so while maintaining popularity. So one thing that's very unique about these cases is that all three of these cases that I listed, Putin, Chavez, Erdogan, are extremely popular. And they were very popular when they got elected at first, and they remained popular. So one of the puzzles is, why is it that voters who presumably value democracy would nonetheless vote and support candidates who clearly are undemocratic in how they have acted in office? And the answer is, in this explanation that I'm proposing, is that in a polarized society, even an incumbent that is behaving undemocratically will still maintain a significant support, precisely because it's a polarized society, and so those who support him are not going to abandon him for a challenger, because in a polarized society there are these huge differences between voters, and voters are unlikely to defect to a challenger from an incumbent that they support.
Very interesting. And I know this paper you're working on is part of a larger project, a larger book project you're working on. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
So I'm currently working on a book, Democratization in the Age of Elections, and the key idea for the book is to explain how either transitions to democracy, or what I just spoke about, that is the breakdown of democracy, happens after the end of the Cold War. And the key distinctions there is that whereas before the end of the Cold War, we could easily tear apart a dictatorship from democracy by simply asking a simple question, well, does that country have elections? So we had countries like the Soviet Union that would, if have any elections, these would be such that incumbents would be, the Communist Party would be winning with 99% of the vote, so it would be meaningless elections. And then we would have democratic countries that would have meaningful elections. But something that happened after the end of the Cold War, and that is connected to the trends that I was summarizing before, is that today almost every country has some kind of elections. The few that don't have them, like Saudi Arabia or maybe China, seem like they are actually some anachronistic cases that have been inherited from the Cold War era. But nonetheless, we do have distinctions between dictatorships and democracies. We know that electoral competition in most of Europe and in the United States warrants that we call these countries democracies, whereas the kind of electoral competition that is currently happening in Russia, Venezuela, or Turkey has been so much skewed in favor of the incumbent that we can no longer call these countries democratic. So people have all kinds of labels for them. People call them hybrid regimes, electoral authoritarian regimes, or competitive authoritarian regimes. But one thing that unifies them is that they do have elections, but those elections are not competitive enough so that we can call these countries democracies. And so what this means is that if we want to understand transitions between democracy and dictatorship today, it is not going to happen where we'll have a dictatorship that doesn't have elections, and that dictatorship is at some moment going to transition into a country, a democracy that will have elections, but rather that a country that has highly imperfect, uncompetitive elections is going to make those elections fair and competitive. And what, as political scientists, we don't understand well is precisely what governs that transition. Why is it that some countries are like Russia, whereas others are perfectly competitive?
Extremely important work you're doing. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Svolik and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.